On behalf of UAF Summer Sessions and Lifelong Learning, I'd like to welcome all of you here in the room, as well as anyone watching via live stream right now, to this evening's Discover Alaska lecture. My name is Katie Kennedy, and I am part of an organization for educators that's called Delta Kappa Gamma. And a member of our organization will come each week to introduce our Discover Alaska speaker. Before I introduce our speaker this evening, I'd like to let you know that at UAF, we acknowledge the Alaska Native nations upon whose ancestral lands our campuses reside. And in Fairbanks, our Chaltiadak campus is located on the ancestral lands of the Diné people of the Lower Tanana River. This year, our Discover Alaska lectures are all being presented by UAF College in cooperation with the UAF College of Indigenous Studies. Very lucky to have faculty members willing to share their knowledge with us this summer. Tonight we're going to hear from Kevin Illingworth. He is a professor of tribal governance with the College of Indigenous Studies here at UAF. Kevin grew up in Interior Alaska. He is a graduate of North Pole High School and the incredible University of Alaska Fairbanks. He also has a law degree from the University of Idaho. Kevin has worked here at UAF since 2002. Before that, he worked for both the Mentasta Traditional Council and the Chishna Tribal Council, focused on the development of tribal laws, tribal courts, and tribal law enforcement. Tonight, he will be speaking to us about the history of colonization, indigenous land claims, and sovereignty in Alaska.
Thank you so much. Well, thank you all very much for being here. I want to start, I guess if you'd like the PowerPoint. I just want to start, some of you have a timeline. I left some copies of it as you come in. I was going to start with just a little bit of the development of the timeline. So, like you said, my name's Kevin. I grew up here in the interior, and most of my schooling was here in Alaska, elementary, junior high, high school, college. And remarkably, I knew almost nothing about Alaska history through all of that. Alaska history certainly wasn't a required subject at the time. And even if you did learn anything about Alaska history, certainly didn't learn anything about Alaska Native history. And so I've been very fortunate throughout the last 25 years working for tribes and working with tribes to travel around Alaska. And every time I travel to some place, somebody shares some information with me that completely just knocks my socks off, blindsides me. Things that I just are hard to even believe that they're true. I had an elder tell me that he volunteered for the Korean War. When he came back to his village, and his village was on fire. It was being burnt down to make room for a park and a harbor. This was 1961. And this was done in cooperation with the BIA and the city of Juneau. It was crazy things like this that really caught my attention. And so I started putting together all these things that I was learning in this timeline. It's turned into something like 5 pages now, and really focuses on laws and events that are significant to Alaska tribal governments. So from that, I guess what I figured out growing up here is that I really had been sold a real false narrative of Alaska history. Something that just frankly wasn't true, or at least left out almost all the facts. This idea, this false narrative that Alaska Native people were passive victims of colonization, that somehow the United States came into Alaska as a benevolent ruler. This idea that we still hear today that somehow Alaska Native people are different or worthy of less rights than indigenous peoples in the lower 48. It's just absolutely not true. what we find out and what we see is that there have been continual efforts by tribes, by tribal governments in Alaska to engage diplomatically with the United States on a government-to-government level since 1867, since the United States came to Alaska. From the United States side, we're really going to see both significant efforts to recognize and settle indigenous land claims and recognize indigenous sovereignty, while at the same time, there's a parallel effort to just completely ignore sovereignty and ignore land claims. And sad to say, this still continues to today. So I really want to acknowledge I'm talking about other people's history, and I see some friends and friendly faces in the room. I want to apologize because I'm talking about something that I don't fully know, and I'm talking about people's history that's not my own. This timeline is a basis for a federal Indian law class that I teach. It's 14 hours of the same timeline. So you guys are getting this in less than an hour. So I'm going to be skipping a whole lot. I really apologize. There will be question and answer time at the end. If there's things that I say that sound funny or that I skipped over, please bring them up. So with that, let's get started. So I do want to start with a little bit about our eras, our overall idea of federal Indian law, because this really does impact Alaska in a number of different ways. So when scholars talk about the history of federal Indian law in the United States, we talk about a pendulum swinging back and forth. And that pendulum sometimes swings in favor of tribal sovereignty, and it sometimes swings against tribal sovereignty. We put labels on these labels, and the exact years aren't important, but what's important is we're seeing this trend, political pendulum swinging back and forth. Now, what's super important for us is this early period, the international period, this treaty-making period. This lasted from 1781 to 1871. This is when the United States treated tribes as foreign governments, the same as they would any other foreign government, engaging with them diplomatically. Notice Alaska was purchased in 1867, just a couple years before the end of treaty making. Now, the United States ended making treaties with tribes because of a fight between Congress and the president. It really was a separation of powers issue. And the Congress decided that they were not going to ratify any more treaties with tribes. And so there are no treaties with tribes in Alaska, which sometimes people say is a detrimental thing. From my point of view, it means that all of Alaska is unceded tribal territory. Alaska tribal governments never agreed to give up any of their land. It was simply taken away. Now, what's important, again, Alaska was purchased right during the beginning of the allotment and assimilation period. This really is the period of genocide in the United States. This is a terrible time where the official United States policy was, quote, to get rid of all things Indian. There was no appetite for recognizing tribes. There was no appetite for recognizing sovereignty during this time. The pendulum did swing back into what we call the Indian New Deal period, also the Indian Reorganization Act period. All of these happening at really important times for Alaska because we swung back to the termination era right as Alaska became a state. Again, a time very opposed to recognition of tribal sovereignty and tribal authority. Whoops. So Alaska was just another part of westward expansion of the United States. And how westward expansion was supposed to happen was that as the United States purchased territory, the U.S. would send an expedition to determine the territories of the indigenous tribes. Treaties would be entered into to designate what would be indigenous lands and what would be the new state or territory's lands. How else are you going to know who owns what land? And that is exactly what happened throughout the lower 48, everywhere except for Alaska and Hawaii. So what happened here in Alaska? I do want to point out the purchase of Alaska happened right during that end of that international period. The United States was very used to working with tribes, to entering into diplomatic relations, whether that be a treaty or otherwise with tribes. I also want to point out that some of the later treaties that the United States signed right before the purchase of Alaska was with tribes in the Pacific Northwest. I point that out because the tribes in the Pacific Northwest are really culturally similar to the tribes in Southeast Alaska, which are the tribes that bore the brunt of United States colonization. the United States had diplomatic relations with tribes. There's no question that the Tlingit Haida people were tribes under United States law. So I have a really brief slide here for time immemorial. Why I start there and what the importance of that term for lawyers in United States law is that time immemorial, for lawyers that means forever. So time immemorial really means since the beginning of written time, which actually isn't that long ago, written history. But for lawyers, it means forever. So anthropologists and historians could argue about who was here when. It doesn't matter as far as the law is concerned. Alaska tribes have been here since time immemorial, as far as the law is concerned. Now, I also want to really dispel some ideas of this idea that indigenous people cannot own the land. And while you may not be able to own something that's going to be here long after you are gone, Alaska indigenous people absolutely had very distinct land ownership patterns, land use allowance patterns, whatever you want to call it. I have here, this is actually an illustration by former magistrate judge Mike Jackson, and really showing all of the different Tlingit territories, all the Kwans being your different clans. The other one, of course, is a picture of Alaska, and the point why I included this is really to show the extent of Dene Athabascan country. For somebody growing up here in Fairbanks, I consider this Athabascan country, right? When I think of Athabascan country, I think of here. Well, it turns out I'm very narrow-minded because Athabascan country extends through, of course, most of Alaska, most of Canada, down through the west coast of the United States and into the southwest as well. This is the same language group. These are the same people. There is extensive trade. There is extensive knowledge moving back and forth. We had trade items in Alaska long before non-natives ever stepped foot in Alaska. So we start with this period of Russian America. The discovery of Alaska by Vitus Bering. Really what's important about that is that kicked off the Russia fur seal expedition. And Russia, just like every other colonizing country, was interested in Alaska because they wanted money, right? They wanted to get rich. And at this time, fur seals were where the money was at. So 1743 is when Russian commercial voyages began. 1763, 20 years after that, the Unungan retaliation attack destroyed and sunk 4 different Russian ships. Now this is actually pretty incredible when you think about it. Russia is one of the most powerful naval powers in the world at this time. I'm going to talk about that more in a second. The Unungan people have their bidarkis, their kayaks. They're able to storm these giant ships with their cannons and their guns and sink them to the bottom of the ocean. We know where each one of these are because the Russians keep meticulous records. In 1784, Shelikov, the massacre at Refuge Rocks, really marked the decline of Unungan independence. But I really want to point out that out of 100 years that Russia was here in the United States, that Russia was here in Alaska, for 40 years, the Unungans fought against them. The Unungans never capitulated. So again, that's one lie I think that a lot of us have heard, that somehow Unungan people, Aleut people, were somehow working with Russian people, when in fact they fought for 40 years. They fought it valiantly as hard as they could and were eventually enslaved and forced to hunt for the Russian people. The Tlingit people, on the other hand, never capitulated and were certainly never dominated by the Russians. In 1802, the Battle of Kiksadi really marked the last major battle between the Russians and Tlingit. The Tlingit started trading with Russians after that time. But the Tlingit never gave up their ownership, so to speak, of the land. Same thing happened as the Russians went up into the Copper Valley. The Otna people declared war on the Russians. The Tlingit, the Otna, they still consider themselves at war with the Russians today. That never ended. Again, I'm really skipping over a lot of this early history. I wish I had more time. I do want to talk about the impact, though, of commercial whaling in the fur seal harvest. 1824 was the first treaty between Russia and the United States. And it opened up Alaska to both commercial whaling, commercial fishing, and trade with the indigenous peoples. This was the time where we had the beginning of Yankee whaling. So all the ships sailing from northeast United States all the way up to Alaska to get oil. It was the most valuable commodity in the world at that time. I do want to take a second, though, and just look at these pictures. For the indigenous peoples of Alaska, this is their introduction to non-indigenous peoples. That whale that you see, that's whale's done. That's going to sit there and rot now. They've cut off the blubber, they've rendered it, they've rolled it up into oak casks, it's on a ship, it's already headed out of here, and that whale is just going to sit there and rot, and that's what happened across the whole north and west coast of Alaska. Worse yet is what happened when you were enslaved to take fur seal. Those are big bats. You hit the fur seal over the head so that you don't ruin the fur. The fur seal may or may not be dead. You cut the fur off of the fur seal and the body is dumped in the ocean. Not only is it incredibly cruel, it's incredibly wasteful, and indigenous people were forced to do this. This is their introduction, again, to non-native people. Now, the bottom of the slide, you see the Civil War. And I have to be honest, I was being interviewed about some of Alaskan sovereignty and history, and somebody who was being interviewed with me was asked what was the most important thing that happened to impact Alaska's history, and they said the Civil War. And I just thought that was nutty. How did the Civil War impact Alaska? And so I had to learn more, and in fact, this person, and I want to acknowledge Will Mayo, couldn't have been more correct. The Civil War was incredibly impactful on the United States, or on Alaska, for a number of reasons. First off, just as a bit of trivia, the last shot of the Civil War was actually fired here in Alaska when the Shenandoah fired on a Yankee whaling ship a month after the end of the Civil War. But the real reason really was the massive militarization of the United States that happened at that time. Every single able-bodied human in the United States really was drafted in the war effort. Every single able-bodied man fought, and what they learned to do was fight. At the end of the war, of course, you had all these slaves that were freed. The United States then entered its period of what we call today manifest destiny, that the United States was going to stretch from sea to shining sea. And so that's when we saw the westward expansion of the United States and the beginning of the Indian Wars. 1854 to 1890 is essentially what we consider the period of the Indian Wars in the United States. Now, in 1867, there was a purchase of Alaska. I guess it's important to note, just because of current events, if no other reason, that Russia was, at this time, had been the most powerful naval force in the world, was considered one of the most powerful countries in the world. They just lost the Crimean War. This was an incredibly expensive endeavor, and because of that, Tsar Nicholas made the decision to sell Alaska. This is incredibly unpopular and led to the revolution in Russia, contributed to it. Now, for us, what's really important for indigenous people in Alaska was the change in their political status with the purchase of Alaska. So according to Russian law extended to the redoubts, their forts, and anybody that lived within the forts, and of course to their people as they left the fort. There was no attempt by Russia to extend their law over indigenous peoples that were not related to the redoubt, to the fort. So if you worked for the Russians, if you came and lived with the Russians, you had to follow Russian law, otherwise their law didn't apply to you. According to the treaty that the United States signed, at one moment in time, in 1867, every single Alaska Native person suddenly became subject to the laws of the United States. The Treaty of 1867 said that the United States will treat the indigenous peoples of Alaska with the same laws that they treat the indigenous peoples of the lower 48. Now, I tell you, that actually would have been great if that would have happened. But as soon as the United States said that, they pretty much started to ignore that. So, of course, this was the period of the Indian Wars, and the United States came into Alaska in the same vein. In 1867, in a letter describing U.S. policy in Alaska, it called for vigilance in dealing with the Tlingit. Always have your guns ready to fire and hold the entire tribe responsible for the crime of an individual. Secretary of Interior Seward toured Alaska with the military commander of Alaska, at that time General Davis, who reminds Sitka with only 2,000 whites and 25,000 Indians in Alaska, a display of military force is needed. And the United States burns Cake, and later that same year they destroyed Wrangell. That's one of the bombardments that they used to destroy Cake. It was unexploded. I actually saw that when I was visiting Cake about 20 years ago, just sitting in the middle of a table. We could touch it. In 1870, and so I just want to point out this for just a moment. The Tlingit had been fighting war with Russia. The Tlingit never capitulated to Russia. When the United States comes in, the first thing that the Tlingit do is engage diplomatically with the United States. They don't try to go to war. Why is this? The United States was not a strong military power at this time. We just fought the Civil War. Russia was a hugely strong military power. The Tlingit could have resisted. I don't know the answer. I'd love for somebody to do some research and find out. I've been told by a friend that for him, he is Tlingit in Southeast and a chief, he thought it was completely obvious. His great-grandfather had been trading down in Seattle and San Francisco for generations. They knew who the United States were. They'd been trading with the United States. They had relations. So when the United States came to Alaska and replaced the Russians, okay. So testimony in Congress by the Tlingit, the dissatisfaction among the tribes, the fact that Alaska was sold without their consent, arguing that their fathers originally owned all this country, but allowed Russians to occupy it for their mutual benefit, and that any proceeds of the sale should have gone to the tribes. General Davis reported, quote, "The Tlingit do not like the idea of whites settling in their midst without being subject to their jurisdiction." Yeah, if you come to my community, you do have to follow our laws, right? That's pretty simple. I travel overseas, I have to follow the laws of the community I'm visiting. In 1871, a letter from the Aleuts of St. George complained of slavery under the federal government's leasing of the island to the American Fur Seal Company. Holy what? So this is actually one of the first things I learned on a trip to St. Paul Island. As soon as the United States purchased Alaska, of course, we know the Russians enslaved everybody and had made them collect fur on St. Paul. But the United States then did the exact same thing. Entered into an exclusive lease where the American Fur Seal Company, essentially involuntary servitude is what they called it, everybody on the island. 1875, the sale and importation of breech-load firearms is made illegal in Alaska. Breech-load firearms are the normal guns we think of today, right, with a cartridge. Before the Civil War, we only had muskets. It takes you like a minute to load a musket, right? You have to pack it with whatever, I don't even know, powder and a wad and a bullet, and then you can shoot. Well, breech-load firearms, and of course even the Gatling gun was invented during the Civil War. Well, that was made illegal in a real attempt to keep firearms out of indigenous people's hands here in Alaska. Following that, in 1882, the Navy bombards and destroys Rangoon. Again, another show of force. Meanwhile, on a parallel track, the first boarding school was established in 1878. It was established by Sheldon Jackson in the Presbyterian Church. This is the beginning of the boarding school era in the United States. We all talk about boarding schools like it was a lower 48 thing. The first residential boarding school was here in Alaska. It was Sheldon Jackson who took the idea to his friend and started Carlisle Indian School. Now for us, Carlisle Indian School, its motto was kill the Indian, save the man. It was in Pennsylvania. What does that got to do with Alaska? Well, Sheldon Jackson told General Pratt, I can make sure you have enough children, and half of the first class of Carlisle Indian School were kids from Alaska. Eventually, this you see a map of how the churches decided to split Alaska so that they wouldn't fight amongst themselves over who could preach where. Again, we had across Alaska tribes trying to engage diplomatically with the United States. Chiefs of Afognak and Karluk sent a letter to the governor saying, we can't get any chance of fishing in the streams, as the cannery of the fishermen of all the companies operating here have taken possession of the mouths of the rivers. In response, the United States Congress passes the Salmon Fisheries Act, which prohibited native fishing weirs. This would be the first unlawful, uncompensated taking of indigenous Aboriginal title here in Alaska. Now, I do want to point out, I do have a picture there of the first cannery in Alaska and the first can of fish that came out of Alaska. It's called Klawok brand fish. Why was it so important that Alaska was opened to commercial fishing? Well, salmon was actually the only shelf-stable protein at that time. There wasn't tuna or anything like that. There was canned salmon. It has a high enough oil level that it stays. So around the world, canned salmon was incredibly important. The United States had absolutely fished out the entire west coast of the United States. The Columbia River was the largest salmon-bearing river in the history of the world, fished out. All of the west coast fished out. These people came to Alaska knowing exactly how to find fish in streams. How do you find fish in rivers? You look for fish camp. You look for where the Indians are fishing. And so they took over Klawok's territory and made the first cannery. In 1889, President Harrison, in his inaugural address supporting allotment and assimilation, said that it is fortunate that the United States didn't extend a reservation policy into Alaska, because the allotment assimilation era, they were taking back 2/3 of the land that had been set aside in reservations. So he was saying, well, if we'd set land in reservations, we'd just have to take it back, so that's good. What, 2 years later, in 1871, the first reservation was actually established here in Alaska, Metlakatla. Very different history, and we can talk more about that at a different time. But we had clan leaders, Tlingit leaders sending letters to President Harrison. Next year, a petition asking for the protection of their hunting and fishing rights. People wanting to be able to eat, to be able to live their lives. But up until this time, as you saw, it really was Southeast Alaska that bore the brunt of the United States colonization. That was really about to change with the Klondike. In 1889, the Klondike gold rush, over 100,000 people flooded in the Yukon mining district. The Yukon mining district is everything north of Fairbanks. It doesn't include Fairbanks, but north. Think about 100,000 people on the Yukon River. That's hard for me. That's hard. And I like to tell people, you had 100,000 people and they all came into Alaska with the same thing on their mind. Now, they all sailed up in boats from Seattle. They sailed up in boats from San Francisco, right? We'd been mining maybe in Colorado. And anyway, we get off that boat, we say, I'm hungry. Where is the grocery store? And of course, there isn't, right? And so all these 100,000 people have to eat. And so what are they eating? They're eating the same foods that indigenous people were relying on. We had widespread market hunting. That center picture there is 1,000 sheep curls found by the National Park Service in Yukon Charlie. They were just dumped in a pit after they'd been harvested. Of course, that's Chilkoot Pass. And the other picture on the far right is 5 different steamboats in Eagle. I love Eagle. I feel so sorry just thinking about 5 steamboats of prospectors. Holy moly. At the same time, in 1898, in a meeting with the Tlingit chiefs, Territorial Governor Brady urged the Tlingit to reject any protections of federal Indian law, saying that you must decide for yourselves whether you want to be classed as aborigines, like the wild men of the West. I want to point out that is a complete scam. There is United States citizens and there are native people. You don't get to be some sort of in-betwixt thing, right? There was no way that Governor Brady was saying the Tlingit would be citizens, but he's saying you should reject any ideas of federal Indian law. Why? I really want to point out, all of this is, every single square inch of Alaska at this point is still subject to Aboriginal title. Under federal Indian law, it has not been settled. It is still owned by the indigenous people. The United States has an obligation to protect Aboriginal land from trespass until that title's been settled. So all of the gold mining that were happening, everything's happening in this gray area where land claims have not been settled. And this land, the federal government supposedly has a duty to protect this land from trespass. Now, they sometimes are doing this by making reservations. They're sometimes setting land aside. But for the most part, it's a free-for-all in Alaska. 1903, we saw, because of the widespread starvation, St. Lawrence Island was set aside as a reindeer reserve. It was one of our first reservations in Alaska. Now, 1905 is a really important year in Alaska. It was kind of when things changed. You'll see it's the beginning of what we call the middle period in federal Indian history in Alaska. In 1905, Congress had commissioned a report, and the report on the conditions of Alaska and the conditions and needs of Alaska noted that the rush of prospectors has literally swept the country clean, denuding it of life, leading to destitution and semi-starvation. It called for a modification of game laws, the end of market hunting, and a moratorium on commercial fishing north of the Aleutians, knowing the importance of salmon up the Yukon, the Kuskokwim rivers. Now, of course, that was never implemented. We still commercial fish north of the Yukon River, and now there's no more fish in the Yukon River. Since 1905, we've known this. I want to point that out. 1905 was also the creation of the Tongass National Forest. Now, this is a huge deal for Southeast Alaska because this is the unlawful taking of Aboriginal title. This is all Tlingit territory, and now they're suddenly told you can't step foot on it. They start burning down fish camps. You're trespassing if you come on this land. Now, for somebody that grew up in the interior, I hear the Tongass National Forest, and that is meaningless to me. I did not know that the Tongass National Forest was darn near every inch of Southeast Alaska. Look at this picture. Everything that's green in there was the Tongass National Forest. You could see little yellow places where the towns are, and that part that's covered in ice. I had no idea it was everything. They took everything. 1905 was super important here in the interior because it was the Berrigan case. Now, this is a supposed bill of sale in the Berrigan case, and you had a bunch of prospectors that supposedly bought this land, and you could see they put a little cross where they said the chiefs signed, and that the chiefs had agreed to sell them this land. Judge Wickersham actually held that under federal Indian law, that the United States had an obligation to protect this land from trespass and that the tribes could not sell the land. So this person, Grail, by the way, was his name, among other notable names here in Fairbanks. The sale of this land was voided. It was super important because this is the first case, the first time a judge had decided that Alaska tribes hold their land through Aboriginal title and that the United States has an obligation to protect that land from trespass. He noted, though, that he was the only judge and that there weren't any lawyers and that there was no chance for that to actually happen. Now, the irony is the Salshakit was the tribe whose land claim was upheld, the first federally recognized tribe in Alaska, and the Salshakit were eventually driven off their land and have relocated primarily to places like Mentasta, Northway. This is followed again by continued engagement. Chief Ivan and Chief William from the Tanana area to the Secretary of War complaining of the troubles we're having with white people. The focus really is on hunting, fishing, commerce, and justice. 1906 was the formation of the Alaska Syndicate. Now, if you haven't heard of the Alaska Syndicate, you've probably heard of J.P. Morgan and Guggenheim before. The two richest people in the world at that time teamed up together to take everything from Alaska. At one point, they did have leases for every non-gold mineral in Alaska. This is actually editorial from a paper in the lower 48. Everybody in the lower 48 was super concerned about the Guggenheim-Morgan Syndicate. They're like, what is the United States happening in Alaska? Look at that. You have Uncle Sam eating gumdrops while the Guggenheim-Morgan Syndicate just takes everything from Alaska. To be clear, if Aboriginal title had been recognized, we would not have had the Guggenheim-Morgan Syndicate being able to have a free-for-all in Alaska. Their largest endeavor ended up being the Kennecott Mine, which weirdly coincides with in 1907, the first starvation relief in Alaska happened in Copper Center because of the large influx of non-natives, the lack of food. Copper, this is super important. For those of you not familiar, Copper Center is the Clutaka. This is the Clutina River. The Clutina River, when I was a kid, is famous because they had salmon as big as I am. Right? They had king salmon that were 6 feet tall. The Clutina, the Copper Center people were really considered rich. They did not have to move. They were in a stationary village for as long as we know, because they were able to trade salmon for any needs that they have. The irony that that's the first place that we have destitution relief. because of the commercial fishing was blocking any salmon from coming up the Copper River almost completely. And we had things like in 1913, gold discovered on the Shoshana River. I mentioned this one just because they kept actually good records. They documented that they killed 2,000 Dall sheep in the first winter to feed people. In 1940, there were over 180 commercial salmon traps operating just in southeast Alaska. 1915 is important because it was a meeting of Delegate Wickersham with the town area chiefs. I want to take just a moment to talk about this meeting because it was important for a couple reasons. At this time, Delegate Wickersham, he was our elected representative to the United States. This was the United States government engaging government to government with the tribes of the region. Wickersham requested the meeting and the tribes agreed, and the next year they had the meeting. Now, a lot of what the meeting, the first day anyway, was about, and what Wickersham thought the meeting was about, was going to be about land claims. And Wickersham actually had an idea that there should be reservations here in Alaska. But he had a really weird idea of reservations. So the reservation that he proposed was that everybody from this region would be moved just north of the Yukon River. And there would be one large reservation for all Athabascan people north of the Yukon River. Yeah. For those that may not know, north of the Yukon River is Gwich'in territory. The Gwich'in would not have been happy with every other Dene people being shoved onto their territory. This is, and of course, from the perspective of the chiefs here, that would have been absolutely laughable and unworkable. Actually, one of the quotes from the chief, Chief Alexander, I believe it was, said that in talking about homesteads, allotments, that we can't be put on allotment. If you put us in an allotment, it will be like a rabbit in a cage and we'll die. It was Chief Joe from Salsha who said, the rest of the world may have been made for white people, but Alaska was made for us, and we just want to be left alone. We don't want a reservation, we just want to be left alone. But that was one day of a 3-day meeting, and the next 2 days of the meetings, while Wickersham came back and he said, let's talk about reservations some more, the chief said, no. We have some other things we want to talk about. The first thing we want to talk about is health care. We don't have adequate health care. You bring in all these diseases, all our people are dying. We need a hospital. The second thing they need to talk about is education. Our lives are changing, our world's changing, our children need education, we want schools. The third thing they talked about was, no lie, government contracting. So at this point, the majority of jobs that we had in rural Alaska was providing food, wood along the telegraph line, along the steamboat lines, and you had to be able to be a US citizen to contract to be able to provide fish or firewood. Indigenous people weren't allowed to do that. Said we want to be able to have jobs. This is what the chiefs really were concerned about. Oh, all right, this goes on, and I'm going to go quickly through some of this. In 17, Chief Goodlataw down the Copper River filed a complaint talking about the commercial fishing on the Copper River leading to starvation. That kept expanding both in the mouth of the Copper River and eventually up the Copper itself. 1925, the Alaska Voter Literacy Act was passed by the territorial legislature. This was a, quote, literacy act, but it really was based on the Jim Crow laws of the South. It was the same way that they kept people in the South from voting. I have to admit, I have a friend, and this is actually on film. You can probably Google it and find it. Embarrassingly, I was giving a lecture, and she had a copy of an Alaska literacy test. And she asked me if I wanted to take it, and I said, no, please, no. I took the test and I failed. I did not pass the test, and I said to her, well, it looks like I wouldn't have gotten to vote. And she said to me, oh, no, Kevin, you're not Native. You got to vote. Only Native people had to take the test. Ironically, 1 year later, William Paul is the first Alaska Native voted into the territorial legislature. Now, William Paul is hugely important in our story. We don't hear about William Paul here in the interior, but William Paul you hear about a lot in Southeast Alaska. William Paul was important for a couple of reasons. He was one of the first children sent to Carlisle Indian School. He left Carlisle Indian School, and he became the first Indigenous attorney in the United States. He worked in the lower 48 almost his entire life. until he decided he was going to come back to Alaska. He wrote a lot about how he never fit in, how he didn't understand, and that he spent his whole life trying to learn his ways. But an elder said to him one time, he said, "William, this is your land. Why don't you fight for it?" And so William Paul really did then take up the mantle of trying to help organize the idea of fighting for indigenous land claims in Alaska. In 1925, the Alaska Native Brotherhood sued the United States for the taking of the Tongass. They lost in 1929 because the courts held they were not a tribe. They allowed non-Native people to be in the Alaska Native Brotherhood, so you're not a tribe. So in 1935, Congress actually passed a law recognizing the Central Council of Tlingit Haida Indian Tribes so that they could sue the United States. So you had courts say you're not a tribe. Congress said, well, we'll recognize a tribe, so you could sue. In 1959, they actually won, which I will come back to. This is an era of a real change in Alaska. 1930 was the formation of the Tetlin Indian Reservation. And in the Tetlin Indian Reservation, the land was placed under tribal jurisdiction to promote the interests of the natives in restocking the country and protecting the fur-bearing mammals. So the United States was putting large swaths of land under the jurisdiction of the tribes to help rebuild the animals that had been commercially hunted or trapped during this period. 1936 was the passage of the Indian Reorganization Act for Alaska. It was 2 years earlier everywhere else. This was a recognition of tribal governments in Alaska and expansion of the reservation era in Alaska. We had over 150 reservations in Alaska at one time. In 1942, we had a solicitor's opinion confirming Aboriginal fishing rights. It said the Indian who has been forbidden from fishing in his backyard has not thereby lost his Aboriginal rights thereto. Trying to find that solicitor's opinion took me about 10 years. That thing has been buried. It is almost impossible to find. 1943 was the formation of the Venati Reservation. Now, this is a really weird time in Alaska, and again, this back and forth. Because in 1943, while the federal government set aside 1.8 million acres to protect the Native community from non-Native trappers, the exact same time, the Nungan residents of Southwest Alaska were being imprisoned into internment camps. That center picture there you see is the former cannery at Funter Bay. We imprisoned our own indigenous peoples. In 1950, Delegate E.L. Bartlett issues a grave warning to the residents of the Kobuk to reject a proposed reservation. He says, I don't want Washington to have absolute control over 1/3 of Alaska. There's a lot of irony there, I'm going to point out here in a little bit. In 1957, Project Chariot. Project Chariot was an idea by the Atomic Energy Commission that they were going to blow up a series of nuclear bombs just outside of Point Hope. This was one of the first examples of civil disobedience in the world, really in the United States, certainly. The Tigyak people from Point Hope occupied the site. They said, blow us up. You're going to blow up a bomb, blow us up too. And of course, the United States didn't. I have to say I'm surprised. This was a huge win, though, and this really started to bring together indigenous people across Alaska, because this is a really time where we saw information starting to spread. Now, in 1959, I said really important year, the Tlingit Haida won their federal court case that held that the United States, when they formed the Tongass National Forest, was an unlawful taking of Aboriginal title. They were ordered to pay $7.5 million, essentially the price the United States paid for Alaska, in compensation. The decision clearly said every other tribe in Alaska has a similar claim. Think about that, 1959, everybody was put on notice. Every tribe in Alaska has a similar land claim to the Tlingit. Of course, statehood happened. Alaska Natives were not allowed to vote for the most part in the Statehood Act unless you had passed your literacy test. Of course, all the military people who were up here for the war effort, they did get to vote. But part of the Statehood Act, and this is part of the United States Constitution today, so I want somebody to reconcile this for me. As a compact with the United States, said state and its people do agree and declare that they forever disclaim all right entitled to any lands or other property, including fishing rights, the right to title which may be held by any Indians, Eskimos, or Aleuts hereinafter called natives, or is held by the United States in trust for said natives. Language exists, pretty much ignored. So really after statehood, we had the build-up to the Alaska Native Claims Settlement Act. The picture in the upper left is the Barrow Duckin. This is actually, if you want to watch something cool, the North Slope School District did a reenactment of this, and it's a video online. It's really cool. What happened here was an elder was cited for shooting a duck. The Migratory Bird Treaty had been passed, what, in 1924. It had just never been enforced. It had been ignored for the most part. Nobody knew it was illegal to hunt birds up here. Somebody was charged, and the entire village essentially turned themselves in with a duck saying, well, if you're going to arrest our elder, you have to arrest us too. The Fish and Wildlife person actually left the village that day, flew back to Anchorage, said, I'm not doing this. 1961 is when the state starts selecting a lot of different land. For us here in the interior, it was Minto Flats, an area where the state really started selecting all around Old Minto. I mentioned 1962, I guess, is when Douglas Indian Village was burned to the ground. The head of the BIA in Alaska was actually on the Juneau City Council and agreed to the burning down of Douglas Indian Village. I mentioned that this elder, well, he was a young man at the time, he came back and he saw the whole village was on fire. Nobody was there. They hadn't been told. It was summer, everybody was at fish camp. He said while this village slowly burnt to the ground over the next several days, he would run into buildings as he could and try to rescue out things from people. And he'd pull it out into the streets, people's icons, people's really important things. He was the only one. Everybody just saw all the other people just watch this village slowly burn down. Rampart Dam was proposed in 1963. Rampart Dam was this great idea to provide us all with free electricity. All we have to do is dam the Yukon. There's a lake there that you see that would have been formed. It would have flooded out all of the Yukon River villages. But don't worry, we were going to stock the lake with carp so that people would have something to eat. The state also closed the subsistence fishery at Benzinitas. This is Katie John's fishery. I'm going to go through some of this last stuff fairly quickly. I see we're running a little short on time. As we get close to the Alaska Native Claims Settlement Act, one of the most important things that happened really was Secretary Udall and the land freeze. We talk about oil on the North Slope, but there was actually a land freeze. Nobody was allowed to claim any land. Nobody was allowed to buy or sell any land to force the state of Alaska to the table for Alaska Native land claims. But the state of Alaska wasn't interested in doing that until finally in 1968, oil was discovered. I do point out that it was Senator Jackson from Washington State that actually introduced the first Alaska Native Land Claims Settlement Act. And it would have been a land claims bill based on treaties very similar to the Pacific Northwest tribes. But in 1971, the Alaska Native Claims Settlement Act was passed as it is today, extinguished Aboriginal land claims and formed the Yangtze corporations. Now, I said this at the beginning. I always like to point out there was not a vote. This did not come from the Alaska Native community. This came primarily from a person called Douglas Jones and Mike Gravel and the United States Congress. So the United States Congress passed the Alaska Native Claims Settlement Act. Alaska Native people were told, there you go. Voting Rights Act. In 1975, Alaska became subject to the Voting Rights Act because of our long-time literacy law and in suppressing Alaska Native vote. We still are subject to the Voting Rights Act today. And in 1976, with the Toboluk versus Lind case being settled, the boarding school era in Alaska comes to an end. Well, that's a little premature. In 1976, Alaska agreed to end boarding schools. The last boarding schools actually didn't close until the late 1980s. People my age were still being sent to boarding schools. In 1979, the Alaska Supreme Court ruled that the United States Constitution guarantees a free exercise of religion, protects taking moose for potlatch. A really important case that somehow has not been expanded upon or looked at again. In 1980, following that was Anilka. Now, this is where I said the irony that Alaska doesn't want the federal government having control over 1/3 of our state. After Anilka and after, of course, the Statehood Act, Alaska, the federal government has control over 2/3 of our state. And because of the state of Alaska not following Anilka, In 1993, we had the federal takeover. So I guess I've skipped something here. And Alaska is the only state where the federal government manages hunting and fishing on federal lands. Every other state manages all hunting and fishing on state and federal lands. Alaska is the only state that has lost the authority to regulate hunting and fishing on federal lands. Really important thing happened in 1988. You think things are going smoothly, and then suddenly the Alaska Supreme Court says, no, there's no tribes in Alaska. ANCSA extinguished tribes. Nah, never mind, y'all are just gone. 1994, Congress reacted with the passage of the federally recognized Tribal List Act. So in 1994, Congress passed a law that recognized 226 tribes. We have 231 today. This removed any question as to the status of tribal governments in Alaska. But that did not stop the state of Alaska from fighting. In 1998, we had the Venati tax case where the Supreme Court held that ANCSA lands are not Indian country. Some people say tribes were sovereigns without territorial reach. 1 year later, in John versus Baker, the Alaska Supreme Court recognized that Alaska tribes have jurisdiction over their members regardless of where they're located. That in fact, in Alaska, tribes are sovereign without territory boundaries. Your sovereignty reaches as far as your tribal members are. We had the Katie John case where Governor Knowles agreed to fight Katie no more. That was right when I started working for Mentasta. Of course, our next governor decided he was going to fight Katie more, and that went back and forth and is still going on today. 2009, Secretary of Interior Salazar announced that the federal government had failed in its federal trust responsibility to protect Alaska Native subsistence. He ordered a comprehensive review of subsistence. A little has changed, but I think that we are still in this same situation where the federal government has failed in their trust responsibility to protect Alaska Native subsistence. The last of these timelines we actually go through where we see the state of Alaska keeps fighting tribal governments, and not just the idea of land into trust or Indian country, but the idea of sovereignty or tribal authority at all. In 2009, the Ninth Circuit, after being sued by the state, the Ninth Circuit held that Alaska tribes can initiate adoptions in tribal court. In 2011, the state of Alaska sued the Tanana tribe, and the Alaska Supreme Court held that tribes can initiate and adjudicate child welfare cases in tribal court. I don't understand at all why the state of Alaska would try to stop tribes from protecting children. It blows me away. We went on with land into trust, the Akiak case, the state of Alaska, or the Ninth Circuit held that it's unlawful to discriminate Alaska tribes. The state of Alaska appeals. They lost in 2016. The state declined to appeal to the United States Supreme Court, allowing tribes to put land into trust. In 2017, we finally had the Alaska Attorney General say that, under Governor Walker, saying it's clear there are, in fact, 229 tribes in Alaska. Change of administration, and suddenly land into trust was suspended. A couple really important things happened in the last several years. In 2022, Congress passed what's called the Alaska Tribal Public Safety Empowerment Subsection. What this did is it actually designated territory around villages as land that's subject to both the civil and criminal jurisdiction of tribal governments. And so this is just a short picture of these geographic areas where Congress has now said tribes do have both civil and criminal jurisdiction. Now, criminal jurisdiction over any Alaska Native or Native American, and then civil jurisdiction, including civil jurisdiction to issue protective orders excluding non-natives from the village. Finally, in 2022, the Alaska legislature passed a bill recognizing tribes. So in 2022, the state of Alaska has fully gotten on board. There are, in fact, tribal governments in Alaska. But in 2023, the state of Alaska sues to stop land in Alaska being taken into trust. They lost in 2024. They've appealed. That's pending. 2024, there was a solicitor's memo that says that native allotments are subject to tribal jurisdiction, and that has now been on hold by the federal government, and the state of Alaska has sued, and that's in court too. So despite we're all the way through today, 2024, we still seem to be in this same back and forth where we're trying to figure out what is the sovereignty of tribes in Alaska. Well, I appreciate you all being here. I said we'd have time for some questions at the end, and it turns out there's only a few minutes left, but I would love to give some time for some questions if anybody has anything.
Well, I'll bring this over so people can hear your questions. Raise your hand if you'd like, Mike.
Well, hi, my name is Harold. Given the long history of Alaska Natives and the tribal governments and such, and of course I've lived here all my life and seen most of these recent items and lived through a lot of them. But it seems that the subsistence issue has always been at the forefront of Alaska Native issues, and one of the things that happens during development and roads and such is folks used to move around a lot in Alaska, and just small bands. It's not like Africa where there's a bunch of game to be, I don't know, to be had, but so bands would move around and subsist that way on a limited amount of resources. So it's always been a battle for Alaska Natives to fight for subsistence and game rights. And I guess the question is, what do you see it might be in 2040? What might it look like in this sheet here as far as Alaska Natives? Would you say that Alaska Natives in 2040 would still be in a limbo state as far as a management of fishing resources and somewhat not? I think Alaska Natives has always tried to subsist and take care of the game, and some folks seem they know better than maybe the state or federal government fishing game management and how to manage it. So I guess the question would be, how might that look in 2040? Do you believe that we're going to get at an ending point and the tribal governments may have more say-so or sovereignty, or this is how it, or be able to say, this is how it is and this is where the buck stops and we're managing our resources because we know how to manage our resources?
Yes, so I think the short answer is I think we absolutely will be in a different place, and that Alaska tribes will have a much greater role in both managing and decisions regarding to hunting and fishing. And the reason why I say that, I think for a couple of reasons. First, I really want to compare and contrast what happens in Alaska and what happens in the lower 48, where tribes absolutely have the exclusive jurisdiction over hunting and fishing, on reservation, and many of them even off reservation. And here in Alaska, nothing. But also because one of the challenges I think that we face here in Alaska, and I really like to point out the difference between when we think something has commercial value and extractive resource industry value and when it doesn't. Because when we look at marine mammals today, there is no extractive resource value. Marine mammals are subject to co-management, are subject to the exclusive hunting and fishing of Alaska Native people. Fish, on the other hand, things that are subject to sport hunting, the state sees as having a commercial value, and so the state has been fighting that. But I do think the federal law is very clear. The federal government does have a trust responsibility to protect Alaska Native hunting and fishing rights as their way of life. When we use terms like subsistence, we use terms like game. It's not a game, right? This is people's way of life. And it absolutely needs to be protected.
Kevin, maybe you can just take a moment or two to just talk about the immediacy of how our current land status, the protections we have under D1, and if those are potentially lifted, how that might impact our hunting and fishing, and that's a decision that could happen any day.
So I guess I'd say it even just more broadly than D1. Right now, of course, we have a lot of decisions that are being made and temporary protections that we see as being very temporary. And I think that was part of the point of seeing this timeline, is that when things are done through executive fiat, they are very easy to change from one administration to the other. We really do need congressional action and permanent protection.
Can I just expand?
Yes, please.
And then maybe I'll ask you for one other thing, and then I don't know if there's any other questions. So D1 comes from ANCSA, the Alaska Native Claims Settlement Act. It's a section that the Secretary of Interior, placed on the land, so that during the land freeze that there wasn't any development, right? So, and that's 28 million acres, about 1/3 of Alaska. And so that right now is a point that this administration is potentially looking at lifting. So and there's been huge public outpour in retaining those, not just from the Native community in Alaska, but also from the business community and many of our businesses that rely on what makes Alaska special. But that's under, and then so if that is lifted, then that 28 million acres, or any portion of that, could be then turned over to the state to manage. It doesn't come under the federal management. And that could happen at any point. And the Secretary is here this week visiting. Opportunities to educate one another is really critical. Yes.
Quick question.
Well, we're recording.
Okay, the question is this. Government to government, and I hate to use the word consultation, but government to government, what is your take on what that means and how that should work?
So I would actually say there's a great deal of difference between a government to government and a consultative relationship. The consultative relationship really is your lowest level of engagement, frankly. I consult with somebody, I listen to what they have to say, and then I make the decision anyway. Hopefully I take into consideration what you said, but the consultation, of course, you don't have to. I think that we move further up on that spectrum to the idea of co-decision making, co-management, right? So the idea of equal decision making. But then even further up is this idea of respect for independent Indigenous decision making. And I think we do see that again in the lower 48 model, where there is no question that tribes have the sole authority over decisions that happen on their lands. Not in all areas at all, but I suppose, but yeah.
Mm-hmm.
And do you see difference between Alaska and the lower 48 in that process?
I think there's historically been a huge difference between Alaska and the lower 48, right? That we've always said that somehow Alaska's different, and by different, we use that as code to mean deserving of less rights. Yeah. And so I think that it has been a consistent effort by Alaska tribes to say, no, we actually deserve the same rights and more. And in some ways, as you see through this presentation, Alaska tribes have been incredibly successful. And in other areas, areas where we see the high monetary value, commercial value, that it has been a continued fight. And I think that that's a really fair way to characterize it, the situation right now today, too. There was one all the way in the back, too.
She's been raising her hand in the back.
Thank you.
Hello, my name is Darlene Herbert. I'm a Chaglachian. I'm from Fort Yukon. And I remember my father fighting for Rampart Dam. And his name is Percy Herbert. And they used to go to him and Stanley Jonas. And there's one more, Solomon. And they used to have big signs everywhere on the cabins saying no rampart, no rampart. They had the biggest signs, and they always left the village to go to Canada, where they all meet, and that's where the beginning of TCC, I believe. And he was always gone. I mean, this was a big thing. I mean, they were gonna drown us all and they're all gonna be dead. And then my father was really, he was really concerned about the village not having a school. So at that time, you know, they're down in Juneau talking to people, and then I forgot the guy's name, but somehow he managed to go to high school in Fort Yukon at the same time. And these three Native people, when we stand together, we are very strong, and they beat it, and we're still there. And I hope we're there forever. Thank you.
Thank you.
I think I had just more of a comment, and as far as this, how the system went down since the land claims and how it was structured to become Native corporations. And I myself, I'm a product of the Native corporations, and I went to school at university, graduated here in '95, and they supported my education at that time. Then I went and worked for the Doyon and the village corporations. So I kind of have an understanding, and one of the things that though I noticed as far as the strength, like Darlene was talking about standing together, is the corporations, the structure of the corporations and the land divided everything up and like broke Alaska into 1,000 pieces, and it's now recognized as private lands, so there's no, it's quite confusing actually. You might have the Venati Reservation Art Village, and it's all one swath of land, so the structure of the whole thing, it's almost as it's meant to be broken down to break it in 1,000 pieces, then no one corporation or village corporation can have enough power to say. But all other aspects of the law, it's private land as opposed to sovereign land, I guess you could say. So there's no one person or organization can speak for or coming together, like Darlene was saying. The system seemed to have been designed that way, somewhat, and then at the same time, you know, I support the corporation because we advanced a lot more than I see maybe reservation advance as far as education, profit-making companies. It's just a breaking up of the two. And so I think the question that I had was, what does it mean putting land into a trust? The corporation owns the land, but the tribal government is a separate entity. There's like separate entities. So the tribal government does not own any land because the corporations own the land, at least where I'm from. What does it mean to put land into trust?
All right. So that'll probably be our last question. There's a lot to unpack there. So I want to say that the separation of land into multiple different jurisdictions, governments, conflicting things, that was absolutely intentional. I mentioned Douglas Jones. If you want to look him up, he absolutely was a person who decided that if we separate people into different groups, it will keep them from coming together. And also, he expected the corporations to fail, that the land would go back into non-Native hands. This is all documented. He thought he was doing a great thing, tricking all the Alaska Native people. Of course, corporations have been incredibly successful and are now the economic backbone of the state of Alaska. But the jurisdictional difficulties, confusion that you talked about, right? It's in everything in our lives. It is even amplified when you talk about hunting and fishing. For me, if I want to go out hunting around here, I know where the land is. You go out to rural Alaska, well, you have state land, you have federal land, you have corporation land, and in fact, tribes do own millions of acres of land here in Alaska. Tribes own land that has been transferred from corporations. So Venati transferred the land from their corporation to their tribe, so their tribe owns 1.8 million acre. Beaver owns a lot of land. Different tribes own a lot of land in Alaska. To put that land into trust is to essentially give that land Indian country or reservation type status. That land would then be under the jurisdiction of the tribe and not the jurisdiction of the federal government or the state. Now, when I say tribes own land, Tlingit Haida just put land into trust. Craig has put some land into trust. We're not talking about large pieces of land at this point because probably of that word trust, right? There's not a lot of trust in the federal government right now. But it does split ownership of the land between the tribe and the federal government to keep any of that land from ever falling out of tribal ownership. So it's essentially putting a block on any of that land being sold or ever taken. That's the reason why tribes in the lower 48 put land into trust every time they get land. Here in Alaska, it is absolutely controversial, I'm not going to make light of it, of whether tribes want to put land into trust or whether they want to keep it as corporation land or just tribally owned land. The major difference, and I'm going to just be clear, is who has authority over that land. If it's private land, if it's corporation land, the state has jurisdictional authority over that land. If it's land put into trust, the tribe is the one who has jurisdictional authority over that land. So that's your basic difference right there.
Let's give a round of applause. Thank you.